ready to begin, so tell me later.
Good morning. The committee will come to order. I want to welcome everyone and welcome to the first public hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. Before we begin our hearing, we will first conduct the organizational meeting. After our administrative business, the co-chair and I intend to recognize members for opening statements. I encourage opening statements at the hearing. In future hearings, we hope to minimize them. Finally, we will hear from our distinguished witnesses who have joined us. Before we consider the committee's rules, we would like to designate the committee's staff director pursuant to the co-chair's authority under the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. Dan Kennery, who currently serves as the staff director for the House Budget Committee, will serve as the Joint Select Committee's staff director with the understanding that he will consult with David Reich, counsel to co-chair Lowy. We will now consider committee's rules of procedure. The proposed rules have been shared with all members of the committee. These rules set out the committee's procedures and are consistent with both House rules and Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. If there are any questions, staff are available to answer those queries. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the committee rules package. My understanding is that we will have no amendments, so I would like to move from the chair the adoption of the rules.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask one question of parliamentary inquiry?
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
My question was, I'd raised before just a clarification on what a majority is. The way the actual bill was written is it's unclear whether it's a majority from each party or a majority total. So that could be 10 people to pass the final product or 12 people. Has that been clarified yet?
Based on guidance that the co-chairs have received, 10 votes total, including a minimum of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, are required to report the committee's legislative recommendations and report.
Thank you. Thank you for putting that on the record.
Thank you. Today's formal hearing record will provide this guidance.
Mr. Chairman,
Microphone.
Mr. Chairman, our staffs have consulted regarding these rules. We're both in agreement. This is a pretty simple, plain vanilla package. The committee will be fundamentally guided by the legislation that set it up, but these rules provide a useful supplement. So I move that the proposed rules be adopted and that the co-chairs be authorized to submit them for printing in the congressional record.
Within a time frame specific, 30 days?
Correct.
Okay. Is there any debate on the motion by the co-chair? If not, the question is on the motion offered by the gentlelady from New York. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The rules package is adopted. That concludes the business portion of the meeting. Now we'll begin the hearing portion of the meeting, and I yield myself 5 minutes. Established by the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, our panel of 16 members is charged with the task of significantly reforming the budget and appropriations process. Prior to this hearing, our panel has met twice to start the conversation and identify the problems. While this select committee is comprised of a diversity of political thought, we've clearly shared a common goal from the start. We believe that the current process isn't working, and reform is long overdue. Perhaps the most visible sign of dysfunction is that Congress has not followed regular order for the budget process for more than 20 years. Fiscal 1995 was the last time Congress passed a budget conference agreement, followed by all of the separate appropriation bills before the beginning of the fiscal year. Since then, it has become commonplace for Congress to rely on short-term funding measures and continuing resolutions in order to avoid government shutdowns. And even those efforts have not always been successful. It is our job to keep the government's lights on. We have failed to do it 5 times. The most important role given to Congress under the Constitution is the power of the purse. This panel is charged with ensuring we can fulfill this essential duty. It is no mistake that our Constitution begins in Article 1 by describing the powers and role of the legislative branch. And I believe that any proposals of this panel should affirm the distinct role intended by our founding fathers. Congress should always be at the center of deciding budget and spending issues for our nation. While respecting the role of the other 2 branches of government, any recommendations from this committee should reflect improvements to the congressional process rather than offer prescriptions for specific budgetary outcomes that benefit Republicans or Democrats. Our goal is to ensure a framework that works regardless of what party holds a majority in either chamber of Congress. And it is my hope that we can come to agreement on recommendations and ultimately develop legislation that significantly reforms the budget and appropriations process. If we can design a better budget process to allow Congress to more effectively put forward its proposals, the budgetary outcomes will ultimately be returned to the American people through the elections. While the Bipartisan Budget Act requires that our panel come up with solutions by November 30th, I believe we can and should get agreement on solutions sooner. So in the coming days and weeks, it is important that we quickly and thoughtfully move through our work. As we identify possible solutions, I urge my colleagues to bring up proposals that encourage and incentivize the completion of budget and appropriations work on time. In recent years, there have been 4 two-year budget agreements. Our work should build on this trend, developing an overarching framework for Congress and ensuring certainty for funding decisions earlier. I look forward to today's discussion with experts on the advantages and disadvantages of various fixes. Today, we will have 2 esteemed witnesses to help talk us through ideas for solutions. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who was appointed as Director of the Congressional Budget Office in 2003 and led the agency for nearly 3 years. He served on President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, and he is currently President of the American Action Forum. Also joining us is Martha Coven, who previously served at the Office of Management and Budget and at the Domestic Policy Council during the Obama administration. Prior to her work in the executive branch, she spent several years at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, currently a lecturer and visiting professor at Princeton University. Thank you, and with that, I yield to the distinguished co-chair, the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Lowy.
And I would like to say thank you and welcome to Co-Chairman Womack, all of our members and witnesses to the first public meeting of the Joint Select Committee. We all have our discontents with the budget process. Having recently emerged from the marathon negotiations over the 2018 Omnibus Appropriations package, I'd put at the top of my list not enacting spending bills until the fiscal year is half over. Our reliance on numerous short-term continuing resolutions and appropriations getting bogged down by extraneous issues. But the process itself, which has served Congress well in the past, is not the fundamental cause of all these problems. The root cause of our current situation has much more to do with deep policy disagreements, often over issues that shouldn't be part of appropriation bills, and a lack of political will. Procedural reforms alone are insufficient, but perhaps an improved process could facilitate reaching and implementing agreements when there is the will to do so. And perhaps changes to the process could help change some norms and expectations about how we function. It's well worth consideration. What kinds of problems should we be tackling? I'd like to find a way to reach much earlier agreement on top-line totals we need in order to make serious progress on appropriations bills. Among other things that would make consideration of appropriation bills in the House and Senate much more meaningful, as we'd be working with common totals and bills more likely to be enactable, rather than leaving all that to the last minute. I'd also like to find a better way of handling the debt ceiling, a process that currently serves no useful purpose, but invites brinksmanship that menaces our economy. And I'd like to find ways to once again make budget resolutions more meaningful and more useful. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this panel and to making progress on the task we've been given. Thank you.
I thank the co-chair. We are in the opening statements portion of this hearing, and we will alternate House and Senate, and Republican and Democrat. And with that, I'll yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really am honored to be a part of this select committee. I don't think there's anything this year that we're going to do that will have a longer-term potential impact on the fiscal nature of our country and our ability to do what we all want to do. We're losing the right to do the right things financially. First of all, my learned opinion after the last 3 years of looking at this very, very closely is that our budget, and I'm going to include our funding process in the United States Senate, is totally broken. While our appropriations process in the House indeed does work, I agree with the co-chair, Ms. Lowy, that the lack of will keeps us from doing many things in the Senate. But I will argue this, that the budget process itself is totally broken. April 15th was this past Sunday, 2 days ago. It's a date that in the Senate we're supposed to have, by statute, we're supposed to have the budget complete. We haven't even talked about the budget yet this year, and I indeed believe we will not do a budget this year, just like we didn't do a budget last year, we didn't do a budget the year before. In 2015, we did a budget in the Senate. It took $7.5 trillion out of the future expenditures of the federal government. But it was fake, it was partisan, and it only lived for 4 months. It was waived in order to do the grand bargain so that we could fund the government that fall. The next year, we deemed a budget so the Republicans could get to reconciliation and do what they wanted to do at 51 votes under the reconciliation law. Then last year, we did the same thing. So we attempted health care, we attempted taxes, all under reconciliation, which is part of the budget process. In my opinion, reading the Budget Act of 1974, that is a bad way to use, it's an improper use of the reconciliation rule. But the reality is that results speak for themselves, Mr. Chairman. Our budget process has only funded the government 4 times by the end of the fiscal year in the last 44 years since the 74 Budget Act was put in place, 4 times. Actually, the federal government has been closed down 20 times in the last 44 years because Congress did not fund the government by the end of a due date, either the fiscal year or the end of a continuing resolution. We're supposed to, in the Senate, since 2000, we're supposed to appropriate 12 appropriation bills a year. The truth is, we've only averaged 2.5 appropriation bills being put on the floor of the Senate and passed in the Senate over those 44 years, an average of 2.5 out of 12. Mr. Chairman, I would argue that there is no way anybody can argue that this process does not need dramatic revitalization. As a matter of fact, I think it takes a zero-based budget approach to the budget process itself, and that is a clean page approach. We are indeed in a crisis financially. We just passed $21 trillion. I would argue that we will not solve the debt crisis unless and until we solve this budget process and funding crisis that we have today. In my opinion, other countries have to fund their government on time. In many countries, their constitution says that if you don't fund the government by the end of the current fiscal year, they dissolve that particular government and they form another one. I just believe that we have release valves in our system here that allow us in the Congress to not do our duty. The number one responsibility of the U.S. Congress is to fund the government. Article 2 very clearly lays out the responsibilities of the executive branch. Nowhere in there, in those itemized responsibilities, is to be involved in the funding of the government or indeed providing budgetary advice. The the OMB Act of 1921 in many ways, in my view, violates that Article 2 piece of the Constitution. And so when I look at where we are today, we don't even start this process until we get an executive branch budget. I think that's wrong. I personally believe there's no higher calling right now for the United States Congress than to finally face up to the failure of this Budget Act of 1974, take a clean page approach, and finally, once and for all, develop a politically neutral platform that allows us to fund the government on time without all this drama and without creating crisis for the rest of the world regarding what are we going to do in terms of funding the federal government the next year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The senator from Rhode Island, Mr. Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to you and your co-chair, Representative Lowy, for your leadership of this group. I hope that we are able to be effective and to discharge our duties here. I note that we are both senators and House members, and the Senate and the House have different perspectives and different procedures. And the problem areas are budget and appropriations, and budgeters and appropriators have different procedures and perspectives. I do believe there are some commonalities. I think we can probably agree together that a 2-year budget cycle makes more sense. We could perhaps even agree that a 2-year appropriation cycle, perhaps staggered year to year, might make some sense. We can perhaps agree that the executive branch doesn't need to have a formal role in the budget timeframe and process, that there's plenty of political interaction to take place so that we don't need to boil that into our scheduling. But I would just like to say a few words from my perspective as a senator who sits on the Senate Budget Committee. I would concur with Senator Perdue that the Senate Budget Committee process is completely broken. It became ineffectual when the Senate went to a 60-vote baseline for virtually everything, and the penalty for violating the Senate budget is 60 votes. A fence that is at the level of the ground is no fence at all. Moreover, the Senate Budget Committee is the mechanism for the delivery of reconciliation, which has been morphed over the years away from its original purpose to become a general partisan delivery system. Both sides, I think, need to stand down on that and redirect the Senate Budget Committee to a budget process. Now, in order to do that, I think there are some baselines that we have to achieve. The first is that we have to create within the Senate Budget Committee at least the possibility of a bipartisan process. Everything about the Senate process right now pushes towards partisanship. We need to create a rule that provides the option of traveling a bipartisan road. If we can get over the hurdle of bipartisanship, then there are some other things we need to consider. If we're going to look at debt and deficit, we have to comply with the mathematics of debt and deficit, which means you have to look at appropriated spending, you have to look at healthcare spending, you have to look at tax spending, and you have to look at revenues. If you're not looking at all of them, you are necessarily mathematically incomplete, and it's virtually impossible to get anything meaningful done. I think everybody who's ever been before the Senate Budget Committee has agreed that debt to GDP is the measure of safety with respect to long-term debt and with respect to regular deficits. So we need to do the basic task of deciding, and I think we can do this, bipartisan fashion, what's a fair and sustainable debt to GDP ratio, and then how long is it going to take us to get there? You don't land a plane by driving it straight down to the ground. You have a glide slope, and we need to have a glide slope. And what should that glide slope be? That's something I think we can also agree to. And then what are the warnings that let you know you're off your landing path, that you're not on the glide slope? I think we can install those as well. If we have a bipartisan path that considers all those elements, tracks us towards a sustainable debt to GDP ratio, and warns the public when we're off course, I think we will have accomplished a very significant task, and the Senate Budget Committee will once again be somewhat useful. I'd close by echoing what Representative Lowy said about the debt ceiling. I see the debt ceiling as like somebody who put a bear trap in their bedroom. And they know they're going to get up in the night, and if they're lucky, their best case scenario is that they avoid the bear trap. There is no good that comes of having that bear trap in the bedroom. There is the chance that you step in it. And if you step in it, it is a catastrophe. If we can build through this process some sense of public confidence that we have a track towards a sustainable debt to GDP ratio, then perhaps we can undo this completely unhelpful, completely manipulable, and dangerous debt ceiling process that we go through, which appeals to the very worst angels of the nature of our very worst angels. So with that, I look forward to working productively with everyone. I do think it's important that we understand that the Senate operates a little differently from the House, and budget folks have different perspectives from appropriators, and we all need to pull together to try to come up with something that can solve this problem. I think it's very doable, and I look forward to joining all my terrific colleagues in doing it, and I thank you both for your leadership.
Thank you, Senator. Based on order of arrival, the next opening statement will be given by the gentleman from Texas, Representative Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Lowy for your leadership to take on this daunting task. Grateful to join my distinguished colleagues, and solving what I believe is not a fundamental, but the fundamental problem for Congress, the budget and appropriations process. We all start with one thing in common. We believe that the process is broken, and I believe we're all truly committed to fixing it and doing it in a bipartisan and bicameral fashion, not just for our institutions, respectively, but for the American people, more importantly, because if there's one area that I think highlights that Congress plays by a different set of rules than the American people, it's certainly the budget process. All someone has to do is review the tape of the past reform efforts. We went over that in painful detail last meeting, and look at the budget outcomes to appreciate the abysmal failure of past reform efforts and the Herculean challenge we have to implement any meaningful reforms in this one. If we don't do something to improve our situation, we'll not only fail our frustrated colleagues and ourselves, we'll fail our children. As a new member and a new generation policy maker, I am convinced that getting to the right budgetary outcome and the right budgetary process is the challenge of the 21st century. And if we stay on the current trajectory, I believe that it is the biggest threat to our nation's future. I don't think I could overstate that. Whether your priorities include infrastructure and the benefits to our economy in that regard, or the food supply and the farm bill safety net that we're working on, I believe that's important to food security. And R&D, as a former vice chancellor for research, I know that helps our global competitiveness. The list goes on and on. We all have our list of what we believe are national priorities. I think we'd all agree on national defense, but it's all going to be in jeopardy if we, God help us, enter a sovereign debt crisis. Not to mention the terrible economic conditions we'll thrust on the next generation of Americans if we don't do something. I don't think that an external threat's going to take this country down, and when I say down, I mean lose our exceptionalism. I think it's going to be like most great civilizations. I think our most formidable foe is ourselves. I think it's our inability to govern ourselves in many ways, but I think this being the greatest example. This ineptitude for self-governance, self-restraint, self-discipline is highlighted, again, I think most prominently in this process. So it seems to me that whether we're either going to make the sacrifices that other generations have made and muster the courage to put our country's interest ahead of our own political interests, or we're not going to have a choice. The harsh and indiscriminate realities of a sovereign debt crisis will force us to make the changes that we must make. And that's a sad state of affairs, that we know that the train is heading for a collision. We know probably, I think, collectively, we know what needs to be done. Will we have the courage to do it? Even in this group, even among this committee, will we have the collective courage to do it? Because if we do wait, we will have lost that privilege, that unwritten pledge that we made when we took this office to hand this country better than we found it to our children and grandchildren. What's our mission? I think, Mr. Chairman, we should start with what is our task at hand, and it should be something that we should be able to attain, but something that is aspirational at the same time, and we'll have to figure out the balance of the two. But it's simply to ensure a process that results in timely and continuous funding for our government, instead of this stopgap shutdown show that we've seen, that you guys have described, and my friend Senator Perdue described in his opening statement. I think the other component, I hope we can get there, I believe we can, is to not just focus on the process, but to ensure that we have a process, mechanisms, and incentives in place for responsible and cost-effective budget outcomes. I hope we can do that. We have to learn from history. We have to learn from our own experiences. But I believe fundamentally, and I hate to say this, but actually I'm going to lump myself in this, but Congress as a whole and by nature, I don't think has the collective will to do this. We have to find ways to align incentives. And if we do that, I think we'll be successful. I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Next to the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the ranking member on the House Budget Committee, the gentleman, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Co-Chair Lowy for getting this process off to a very good start. As I said in one of our initial meetings, I think it's key that we focus on defining the problems we are seeking to fix, and from the tenor and the substance of the opening remarks that I've heard from our members so far, I can see where this is going. This is going to be a situation in which everything will have been said, but not everybody has said it. And I think that's actually very encouraging, because I think it shows that this committee is committed to a very serious, nonpartisan approach to solving what is a very difficult problem. And I find that very encouraging. I think it's been said several times already that whatever we propose should not be aimed at some kind of a philosophical result or any kind of outcome. And I think that's very positive in the way we ought to approach it. I just have a couple of thoughts that have occurred to me, and having been on the Budget Committee now for almost 10 years, one of the things that I think is very important is that most people, when they look at the federal budget, think of it as in terms of the context that they see elsewhere, a corporate budget, a personal family budget, and I think this is a mistake. I think a governmental budget is something that is very, very different from a business budget and from a personal family budget. In the government, we have a responsibility for coming up with a budget, but we're not the managers. The managers are the voters. We're also not the customers. The voters are the customers. And we have to figure out what they want us to do. Of course, that's part of our campaigns. But it's a very different perspective when we're trying to figure out what's an appropriate level of spending for which categories, when we're not the ones who are actually finally ratifying our choices. And the other thing that concerns me, and Senator Whitehouse mentioned this as well, is that in practice, revenues have been totally detached from the budget process. And if you're in a business, as I've been, when you're thinking about what you want to accomplish in your business, other than making money, you think about first what you want to accomplish. I was in the newspaper business. I decided on what kind of product I wanted to produce, and then I decided what resources were necessary. If there weren't enough resources, I hired a new sales manager or a new sales representative who would go out and try to generate more income. And I don't think we can view government quite the same way, but we also can't ignore the fact that revenue is a very critical part of what we do. And this process, at least as long as I've been involved in it, has totally ignored revenue as a component of the budget. When we put out a budget, an alternative budget last year and the year before that, the Democratic budget actually called for increased revenues. And of course, that led to political challenges from the other side. And I don't expect to hear that in this process, but that I think is something that we cannot fail to recognize, that as much as expenditures are important, we have expectations that our managers place on us. They know what they want government to do for them. And we have to figure out not only how to allocate money for those responsibilities, those functions, but we also have to figure out how to generate the revenue as well. So once again, I'm very encouraged by the tenor of the discussions so far in our prior meetings and today, and I look forward to a very productive process. I yield back.
Next to the state of Iowa and the distinguished Senator, Ms. Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman, and I truly am thrilled to have the opportunity to serve on this committee. The most fundamental role of Congress, as laid out in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, is to raise revenue and fund the federal government. And unfortunately, Congress has consistently failed to execute this responsibility in a timely or an effective manner. As noted before, since 1974, Congress has only passed all of its appropriations bills 4 times. Over the past 20 years, we've passed a budget resolution only 11 times. since 1999. Since 1999, we're averaging 5 continuing resolutions per year, 5 per year. Unsurprisingly, our dysfunctional process has also yielded dysfunctional outcomes, growing deficits, and a $21 trillion in debt. This ineffectiveness is not only bad governance, it is a threat to our national security. Our reliance on continuing resolutions has a devastating effect on our military. As a result of our continued reliance on continuing resolutions, only 3 of the Army's 31 brigade combat teams are capable of deploying immediately to conflict. During continuing resolutions, the Army has $400 million less per month in their operating accounts. Richard Spencer, the Secretary of the Navy, has said that inefficiencies stemming from continuing resolutions have resulted in $4 billion in waste for the Navy since 2011. Our constituents deserve better than this cycle of governing crisis to crisis, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in a bipartisan manner to put in place reforms to get our budget and appropriations process working again. Again, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to spend this time with my colleagues working towards, again, a bipartisan fix to this very devastating situation. So again, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and I will yield.
Gentleman from Colorado, Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and your co-chair for such an encouraging start. Appreciate the comments of my colleagues. When I first came to the Senate, I was a little more optimistic than I am today about the ability of Congress to deal with our long-term fiscal challenges. By coming together, I thought we'd figure out ways to pay for investments in the future while curbing spending to stay within our means. In other words, I thought there was a bipartisan commitment to do for our kids and grandkids what our grandparents had done for us. Unfortunately, as we've heard today in a bipartisan way, Congress has excelled over and over again, taking the path of least resistance. We have had, I think by my count, roughly 39 continuing resolutions since I became a member of the United States Senate. And following recent tax and spending decisions by Congress, we're now on a path to have the largest deficits outside of a recession since World War II. The Congressional Budget Office now projects that even as we're approaching full employment, we'll have deficits approaching $1 trillion next year and on track to grow every year after that. At some point, the growing gap between spending and revenue will catch up with us if we don't do anything, and will certainly catch up with the next generation of Americans. In the meantime, we're grinding down the parts of our government vital to our future: education, innovation, infrastructure, and efforts to reduce child poverty, and we're putting to risk the obligations we've made to our seniors, our veterans, and most vulnerable, including Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Mr. Chairman, I'm under no illusion that reforming our budget process is a silver bullet to address the toxic levels of partisanship that seem to infect, for no good reason, everything we do around here. And no process reform can produce the political courage needed to take on the tough fiscal challenges that we face. But I do believe this committee can make important bipartisan progress and demonstrate leadership. I hope that we'll work in good faith. We have a rare opportunity to do that on this committee. My hope is that all of us will keep an open mind and remain constructive in the face of hard and inevitable differences. Here are a few areas that I think we could think about working together. We might create more predictability for appropriators by putting in place a 2-year cycle for top-line discretionary spending levels through so-called biennial budgeting. We'll also need to come up with reasonable enforcement mechanisms that are a constructive push for us to act within deadlines. We should consider creating an appropriations process that is more predictable and inclusive, one that encourages bipartisan work, not partisan work, and limits the meaningless show votes that have become an unfortunate tradition around here. Lastly, we should de-weaponize the debt limit. Senator Schatz and I have a bill to eliminate the debt limit entirely, since it serves no purpose other than risking default. I'm open to considering alternative mechanisms to focus our attention on our actual fiscal problems while eliminating the threat of default once and for all. We should be responsible when we decide revenue and spending levels instead of trying to walk out on a bill when it comes due. I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and all of my colleagues up here to see where we can make progress, to see where we can make a difference. And I hope that we can show the world that even in these troubled times, bipartisan progress really is possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and our co-chairman for your leadership here. I appreciate Speaker Ryan entrusting me with a spot on this committee. Very first vote of significance, Mr. Chairman, that I took in this institution back in 2011, you will remember it, you were a freshman as I was the vote for the Budget Control Act that created the last Joint Select Committee that had a chance to make a difference here. And I was so excited. We only had 2 Republicans in Georgia who supported that bill. I was so excited. I knew I was going to get defeated without question, but I knew I was going to have an opportunity to move the needle for our children and our grandchildren, which is what everybody has been talking about. I can't tell you the disappointment I had when that committee adjourned, having agreed on absolutely nothing. The Congress entrusted that committee with looking at the entire budget over a decade upon decade long window, and they couldn't find a thing to do to make anything better for anybody. I would tell you the men and women of that committee, I'm sure, regret that today and found themselves in a political environment that made that difficult. Mr. Chairman, everything I have heard from every member on this committee in the times we have gathered has led me to conclude we are not going to meet that same fate. To my friend from Texas's point, we have big, lofty, aspirational goals that I hope that we will achieve. I believe that we can. But we also have those areas of fundamental agreement, as the senator from Colorado pointed out, that we absolutely can achieve. There are some floors on our success as well, and I recognize that this is an opportunity that many of us came to Congress to be a part of, doing those things that otherwise would be unable to be done. And I want to encourage my colleagues. We talk about our current situation as if we are experiencing something that no generation before us has experienced, as if we're the first ones to overpromise and underdeliver, to cut taxes while promising new benefits. I will remind everyone of the story of Ida Mae Fuller, the very first woman to ever receive a Social Security pension. Those were our colleagues in 1935 that made those promises on behalf of a nation. And Ida Mae Fuller worked for 3 years under the Social Security system, paid in just over $24 in her 3 years. Her very first Social Security pension check was for just over $22. And she received that benefit over a lifetime that ultimately paid her almost $23,000 in Social Security benefits. So lest you think that our track record together is not that praiseworthy, I will tell you we have not made $22 commitments for which we've paid out $22,000 in exchange. This has long been a problem, and much of the burden that is on us today is to solve problems not that we have created, but that previous generations of members of Congress have created, and I'm pleased to be a part of that. I appreciate the discussion of a glide slope forward, that we're not going to be able to get this all done overnight. But I think back to the Social Security amendments of 1983, another big vote that folks thought they might lose their seats over, restored solvency to the Social Security Trust Fund for decades, raised taxes, reduced benefits in many cases, but took effect far enough out into the future that folks had a chance to plan. I've read the testimony of both of our witnesses. Both suggest that we have process problems that lead us, flawed processes produce flawed products, and process problems that leave us to use tools that were supposed to be productive, and we use them in gimmickry fashions today. I think that much of our job, Mr. Chairman, is to build trust. I have often commented on Chairman Lowy and the trust that she builds on the Appropriations Committee, and we have a chance to do that. I would just close with a cautionary tale, though. I just can't. I've never served on the United States Senate. I've spent a decade as Chief of Staff on the House side, a decade as a member. I don't have any idea the challenges that go on in the United States Senate, but I hear the mention of the debt ceiling over and over again. On the House side, that provides a minority voice opportunity in ways that otherwise the minority has no voice on the House side. Whether you're in the Progressive Caucus or whether you're in the Freedom Caucus, a debt ceiling conversation allows a stop in the process and requires that folks come together. Every single debt ceiling increase, Mr. Chairman, since you and I have come to Congress, has resulted in moving the needle for more responsible spending or more responsible governing every single time. I think we have to think through those challenges that obviously create lots of headaches, but sometimes those headaches are designed to create opportunities. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington, Mr. Kilmer.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I thank both of our co-chairs for your leadership on this. In the fall of 2012, I came to freshman orientation. I was elected for the first time, and they had a presentation from the Congressional Research Service to talk about how the budget process works. And after explaining the rules and the timelines in tremendous detail, they then said, but it never actually works that way. Let us tell you how it actually works. And I understand you have a similar experience teaching at Princeton. So I've only served in Congress for 5 years, but I've spent a lot of time over the last few weeks trying to think through the budget process as I prepared to serve on this committee. And I think I have an idea why Congress doesn't follow the 1974 Budget Act, and it's because it would require Congress to make tough choices. And it's a whole lot easier to simply waive the rules. They tell me the last time Congress passed all 12 bills into law before the expiration of the fiscal year was back in the 1990s. And to me, what that means is that no one in a position of leadership today feels like they're opening themselves up to any sort of criticism if they stray from the budget rules. Here we are 2 days after the Budget Act says Congress was supposed to have passed a budget resolution, and there's no uproar. There's no downside to having failed to act. It's in fact become an expectation that Congress won't follow the budget rules, and that seems like a problem, but I think it also creates an opportunity. If we are able to recommend some reforms, and if congressional leaders from both parties support these new budget rules, then hopefully it'll create some accountability and some pressure to follow those rules next year when the new Congress is sworn in. And that's not to say that a new budget process will lead to significantly better fiscal outcomes right away. I don't think this committee will be able to balance the budget or put us on a quick path to eliminating our deficit and paying down our debt overnight. But I do think there are very real problems that we can solve, and those are shutdowns, the threat of shutdowns, the persistent use of long-term continuing resolutions to fund the government. And we're going to hear from one of our witnesses today. Those are wasteful and inefficient and destabilizing to our economy and unfair to our federal workforce and unfair to our military. You know, I think we got to stop playing that record. I think there are a few principles that should guide the work that, that we're doing as we work toward those goals. First, whatever the budget process we put down on paper, in my view, should reflect the reality of how Congress actually works. I've only served in a post-BCA world where the budget resolution is purely a messaging and political exercise that's frankly largely a waste of time in a Congress that has plenty of opportunities for messaging and political efforts. The real budget process that I've seen involves Congress coming together on a bipartisan basis and passing a 2-year budget law and then working within that framework. And it seems like we should decide which of these paths we want to follow and have a process on paper that reflects that. Second, we should empower the independent, nonpartisan budget organizations. Someone needs to call balls and strikes, and we should do everything we can to insulate the CBO from the excessive partisanship that seems to have affected every other part of our legislative system. And third, we should have a budget that is as honest and as transparent as possible. Congress may need gimmicks to get over the line, but it shouldn't rely on them to make the process work. So as we consider ideas for reform, I think there are a few things that we ought to avoid. First, inducements or incentives to act should be positive and not negative. We've already seen what happens when Congress puts a gun to its head. It ends up pulling the trigger. And I can't think of a single trigger that we could design to force action that wouldn't end up being some faction's preferred policy outcome. On top of that, I think we should create incentives for action, not inaction. Given the option, Congress always seems to want to kick the can. and avoid hard choices. And the last thing we need to do is create a process that incentivizes delaying difficult decision. And I want to close by saying that I approach serving on this committee with genuine hope and excitement that we can make a positive difference. I have had a chance to meet with and talk to many of you who I'm serving with on this, and I hope to get to know all of you better as we undertake this work together. I think it's really important, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let's go to Oklahoma now, and the senator from Oklahoma and my classmate, James Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had folks in Oklahoma that I visited with a couple of weeks ago in a town hall meeting, and I tried to describe this process to them, and they said, what are your thoughts on the success of this process? I said, I'm in the early optimistic phase of this, that we're all together, we're all nodding our heads, saying something needs to be done. Ask me again in July how we're doing, because at some point we'll move from larger concepts of recognizing problems to having to fight through how do we actually get to a solution on this. The problems are fairly obvious to us. In fact, it's been obvious for decades. As one of our witnesses today will mention, I'm sure, today is April the 17th, 2 days past when the budget is required to be done by Congress, yet the Congress hasn't even taken up the budget, much less actually passed it. We have clear issues that we continue to face with the deadlines and the structure as it exists. 18 of the past 20 years, we've had an omnibus bill. We're not even trying to be able to go through the process. What's interesting is to be able to see the history of this. This is not something new, but the battle over leaving it as is or saying that we need to actually have major changes is something that we've not only seen, but it seems to be every time the solutions seem to be the same, and we're reoccurring those over and over again. For instance, Senator Byrd, who was the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee in the 1990s, made the comment that there's not a need to make a change in the budget process because the Senate always gets its 13 bills done expeditiously, was his words, and so there's no need to be able to change the budget process. At the same time, the Budget Committee was making bipartisan recommendations to be able to make major changes to the budget process. I would expect that would occur again. There will be individuals that will stand up in this body and say things are going fine. We're still open, we're still functioning, while this body stands up and says, no, there are major changes that are needed. This is not working. We're going to have to be able to work through that. Most of these issues are not new to us. As I've gone back through the history, as most of the members of this committee have already done as well, and as we walk through as a body together, we've seen some very basic things. Biennial budgeting. Do we need to do this every 2 years? How does the appropriations process work into that? Does the leadership committee need to be able to take the lead on forming the budget, or do we need to have a budget committee determine that? The big fight between authorizing and appropriating that only makes sense in Washington, D.C., continues to come up decade after decade after decade in the arguments, but yet we've still not resolved that. How many bills should come to the floor? How should those bills come to the floor? What's the process with the Finance Committee? Do they engage with that in Ways and Means? The oversight committees and the lack of oversight from the appropriations process. I can't tell you what it is in the House right now, but I believe the Senate did exactly 0 oversight committees on anything in appropriations last year. With over $1 trillion in spending, you would think we could work in at least one oversight hearing through that process. The CBO was designed to be a neutral balls and strikes arbitrator. It has become a great way to be able to game the system, to be able to get done what you want to get done with fun rules like chimps and pension smoothing and whatever rules that may be devised to create a new way to be able to spend money, not to actually be able to get insight and information. CRs, government shutdowns, debt ceilings, all of those things all fall into the chaos of the system. So my hope is that we can take the optimism that we currently have and the recognition that something needs to be done to look back at what has been discussed for decades and to say, how do we break through individuals who will say everything's working fine because I still have power in the process, and everyone else saying, no, this process is broken. Just for the House members that are here, let me describe the Senate Appropriations process that I have the joy to be able to serve on the Senate Appropriations Committee. The bills come to the subcommittee, out of the subcommittee, and you get the text of it the night before. You can't get it digitally, because if you got it digitally, you could search it. You get the text if you go into a room, much like you're going into a classified setting, to be able to flip through the text of that. And then you vote on it with no amendments the next day in the subcommittee. And then it comes to the full committee, and you fight off all amendments during the full committee process, and then you never see it again until it shows up in the omnibus bill. By the way, may I mention, when it comes to the full committee and you actually vote on it in the full committee, each bill, you vote on it first, passing it up or down, and then amend it second. The process is broken from the subcommittee process, the budgeting process, all the way through. And I would hope that this is something that we can address and should address. With that, I yield back.
To the great state of Hawaii, Senator Schatz.
I thank the co-chairs for their great work, and I want to agree with almost everything that has been said. I have a couple of additional thoughts. I think we should do this on an ongoing basis. We may want to consider doing this during every Congress as a good housekeeping for rules and process issues. It took us decades to get where we are, and although I'm optimistic, I'm in the early optimistic phases of this process as well, I am not optimistic that we can fix this in a matter of months, and I think we have to be committed over the long run to iterate this. We are in the beginning stages of the NBA playoffs, and the NBA has a competition committee that continually considers rule changes and brings those recommendations to the NBA's Board of Governors for their approval, and I think this is a good model for us. The Joint Select Committee should be just the beginning of a regular effort to develop reforms in our processes. In terms of specific proposals, under normal circumstances, I wouldn't repeat what was said before, but I want to reiterate my determination to deal with this debt ceiling problem. I see no benefit. I understand what Representative Woodall is talking about in terms of giving the minority rights, but I think that is a broader question about the functioning of the House and Senate. And although there are sometimes some salutary effects for both parties and both ideological perspectives, I think it's basically a trap for ourselves. A couple of final thoughts. We're talking a lot about budget and appropes and not a lot about finance and ways and means. We are very possibly the only legislative body left on the planet that divides budget, appropriations, and revenue in the way that we do. I don't think it's the main problem, but it is a quite convoluted way to do our business. And the final point I'll make is that, you know, success in this process depends on goodwill. The House has their Rules Committee in which they establish a rule for a bill which usually deviates from the normal rules. And in the Senate, just to be clear, the only way the Senate functions and the only way the Senate has ever functioned is if you deviate from what they call the regular order. We need unanimous consent on a daily and sometimes hourly basis to allow the Senate to function. And the only way you get UCs is if you have goodwill. So I want to be cautious about our instinct to establish new rules when, in fact, what we need in the Senate in order for things to function is the waiving of the rules on a regular basis. But the reason that I am hopeful is that this process is the beginning of establishing trust and goodwill, and that is at least what will help on the Senate side. So I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. To Missouri, the distinguished senator from Missouri, Roy Blunt.
Well, thank you, Chairman. And as my friend Mr. Yarmouth pointed out, everybody has said almost everything now, and with great commonality, actually, which is the interesting thing here, the tremendous sense of a common purpose and an understanding that what we're doing now is just not working. We're down essentially to one bill that not only, as Ms. Lloyd pointed out, is the appropriations bill, but now is more and more the one big legislating bill, and this really has to stop. We're at a situation now where basically 4 members of the Congress, the leaders of the House and the leaders of the Senate, maybe 5, maybe possibly 6, and a dozen staffers make way too many decisions in way too closed an environment with not nearly enough information, and all these bills always reflect how far afield some of those decisions have wound up in that environment. At least the appropriators in the House and Senate get a chance to have input on the initial bill, and many questions are decided before they get to those 4 leaders. But bringing this down to one vote, you have one vote on one bill to decide whether you're going to do all the things in that bill and try to weigh that balance. The system was never designed that way. Early on, there was one vote on one bill, but it was a little bill that spent, what did we learned the other day, maybe $5 million was the funding of the government. That's not the case. The president then has also one decision. He gets a chance to sign that one big bill and keep the government operating, or to veto that one bill. This is a foolish position we have gotten ourselves in, and I think everybody understands that. Last week, we had 229 years of congressional history in 36 minutes, but it was a pretty good reminder of just how this system works so well for so long and has stopped working in recent years. Today, we have two really extraordinary witnesses who understand this process as well as anybody, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and thanks to Congresswoman Lowy for leading this effort.
And finally, to the great state of Texas and the chairman of the House Rules Committee, Mr. Sessions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Much has been said here today that I completely agree with. I'm just going to add my few comments. I'm not sure it's all been said yet, but a lot has been said. First of all, let me say this. I think we need to use the word common sense. I think we need to use the word goals, and I think we need to use the word recommendations. I think that there are a cadre of things that we see. We should call them out. We talk about balls and strikes. There are about probably 200 pitches along the way that take place in not only the budgeting process, but the appropriations process, and I think we should delineate those. I think we should have a good idea up front about what are our goals, what are our recommendations, what do we look at as common sense. Perhaps we can or cannot come to an idea. The gentleman Rob Woodall spoke clearly about not disagreeing with Mrs. Lowy or others, but about raising the debt ceiling. I think that should be a huge stop sign. I don't think it should be something that we should blow through and take as pro forma. I think we should expect that is a important element for us to look at. Once again, I will agree with Mrs. Lowy, but we have to do it. We cannot allow us to default, but we need to look at it, that what's the goal and what's the recommendation that we would receive out of it. I think we should also include, and I intend to be a part of this, making sure we put some delineation in about cost of noncompliance. A few people have talked about the real cost that happens to the United States Navy since 2011, us not accurately giving the government, in particular, Health and Human Services, and in particular, the United States military, their money day one. I think it should come as a goal. I think it should come as a recommendation that the largest elements of the United States government must be funded first. It must be a goal. It must be a recommendation. And we should look at those items on a bipartisan basis, on a bicameral basis, and with certainly the President of the United States in Article 2 of a delineation that we believe would be common sense, and that is giving someone that has $600 billion worth of responsibility that you must allow them that opportunity to effectively make plans, do the things that are in the best interest of the country. You can vote for it or against it, but we ought to decide that we're going to do it day one. The other areas, look, I'd like to say, sure, we need to fund all the other areas, and we should not drag that on. But the largest items, I think common sense should prevail. Secondly, I think we should have an idea, and it's been spoken about by our Republican and Democrat colleagues that I'm very pleased to hear, but I think we should call it a pathway to balance. What are we aiming at? We've used the terms, can't get there overnight. I agree with that. But I think we ought to have an idea about a goal and a recommendation that we follow about how we're going to proceed and not add to it. Lastly, I'm going to see if I can push to getting my arms around a look at non-funded or unfunded liabilities in the future. I think we've got to be driven by facts that we all agree with, instead of saying, well, we didn't get our work done, maybe the American people did not expect us to do that. I think that there has to be some opportunity for us to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and that we make tough decisions. I was elected to make tough decisions. We all were. I hope we can use this time to effectively look at goals, recommendations, and common sense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. In the first hour of this first public hearing, you've heard from 14 of the 16 members of this Joint Select Committee, a very thoughtful opening discussion of the challenges that we face and the opportunities that lie in front of us. I'd like now to again welcome our witnesses, Dr. Holtz-Eakin and Martha Coven. Thank you for your time today. The committee has received your written statements. They'll be made part of the formal hearing record. You'll each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. At this time, I'd like to briefly yield to the distinguished co-chair, Ms. Lowy, to welcome our first witness.
Well, thank you, and it's such an honor for me to introduce Martha Coven, who brings 25 years of experience working on domestic policy and the federal budget inside and outside of government. She is currently a visiting professor, lecturer at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. Ms. Coven started her career as a staff member in the House of Representatives, spent several years at the nonprofit Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She is a BA in economics, a JD from Yale, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you for being here today.
Co-chairs Lowy and Womack and members of this Joint Select Committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. When I arrived at OMB, I had no idea I would soon acquire such skills as how to implement a mid-year sequestration, including how to furlough staff, how to prepare to hit the debt ceiling, how to structure exception apportionments under protracted continuing resolutions, and how to manage the government during shutdowns. So much wasted energy has gone into tasks like that over the last several years. So I commend the Congress for forming this committee. As a further sign that it's time to rethink things, I found myself earlier this year cutting dozens of pages from my syllabus. Teaching students how Congress assembles and enforces a budget resolution felt quaint, to put it mildly. So my hope is that I have only temporarily lightened my students' load, and that by this time next year, they will be reading about the well-considered reforms you have produced. Let me begin by offering a few reflections on the existing process. However imperfect a tool the Congressional Budget Act has become, it has left an important legacy. It's created the Congressional Budget Office, a neutral voice telling it straight to members of both parties. And more broadly, as the saying goes, plan beats no plan. And the Budget Act has had a pretty good run. Its framework and complementary measures like the pay-go rule helped guide presidents and Congresses of both parties to a situation where we fleetingly had budget surpluses. So I would caution you against tearing up the existing rules until you're certain you have a better approach. I'll turn now to some specific recommendations for improving the process, though I'll start with a caveat. A wise colleague once observed to me that budget rules are much better at enforcing agreements than at forcing them. What we most need, as many of you have said, is for Congress and the President to set responsible fiscal goals and make tough choices. That said, there are 3 specific measures I would urge you to consider. My first recommendation is to restructure the appropriations calendar to match the congressional calendar. It has become laughable to imagine that appropriations bills could be done by September 30th. Chronic delays in the appropriations process make implementation difficult and get in the way of a shared bipartisan goal of making the most efficient use of whatever funds are appropriated. Your jobs may be done when you finally pass the bills, but for everyone else, the work is just beginning. Delays are frustrating not only to federal agencies, but also to the many other individuals and institutions across the country whom we ask to carry out activities with those funds, including state and local governments, nonprofits, and private contractors. It's hard to make smart decisions or do good planning if you have to scramble mid-year just to get the money out the door. Nothing can fully prevent delays, but 2 steps would help restore regular order. First, shift the federal fiscal year to the calendar year. Both Congress and the President take office in January, so it makes sense to treat that as the start of the budget year as well. You would have the full year to get your work done, and legislation does tend to get wrapped up in December as jingle bells start to chime. Secondly, at the beginning of each Congress, both chambers and the President should negotiate aggregate discretionary levels for the next 2 years. You've done this 3 times already, through bipartisan budget acts, but not at predictable times or in standardized ways. My second recommendation is to end the debt ceiling brinksmanship. Indulging in buyer's remorse at the point when Treasury has to pay the bills risks damaging our economy and harming vulnerable citizens. And my third recommendation is to reserve reconciliation for fiscally responsible legislation. Reconciliation should be used for the politically difficult work of deficit reduction, not the politically convenient work of cutting taxes or increasing spending. Let me close by echoing the comments many of you made and encouraging you to approach your task in a politically neutral manner. Efforts to stack the deck in a progressive or conservative direction will hamper your ability to carry out your mission. Future Congresses need to retain the flexibility to make decisions about the appropriate levels of revenue and spending to meet the changing economic needs of their time and stay true to the people they represent. You can provide a framework for those decisions, but you can't make decisions for them. To that end, I encourage you to set aside proposals that would establish rigid targets or enforcement mechanisms that aim to steer mandatory spending or revenues in a particular direction, or to lock our nation onto a particular fiscal path without knowing what the future holds. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Coven. Our next witness is Doug Holtz-Eakin, who has served in a variety of very important policy positions since 2001. During 01 and 02, chief economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors, where he also served as a senior staff economist, but most notably from 2003 to 2005 as the 6th director of the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. He brings a wealth of experience in the subject matter before this select committee, and we're delighted that he's joined us here this morning on this panel. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, time is yours.
Chairman Lowy, Chairman Womack, members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of being here today. And let me open by simply thanking you for your willingness to serve on this very important committee. I am a longtime observer of this very broken process, and everything I've heard today leaves me in the early optimistic stage as well. I hope I see you again later in a comparably optimistic stage, and that your service turns out not to be thankless. There are enormous budget problems. They take the form of both a debt trajectory that is a threat to this nation and a process that regularly threatens shutdowns of the government, brinksmanship over the debt ceiling, and I think it's important that everyone here recognizes that. I think that's an important early sign. We know that those problems will not be solved by process reforms alone, that in fact there will have to be some very important policy changes as well. But in thinking about the process reforms, there really are 2 branches, and we've heard both of them today. I would urge you to, pick early between radical reforms, clean pages starting over from scratch, versus modifications of the Budget Act. I'm willing to entertain the former, but I think my experience leads me to suggest that on the timetables you have, the latter might be the way to go. I would concur with some previous sentiment that those process reforms should be policy neutral. This should not be a committee that stacks the deck for a particular set of outcomes, however much I might want one or the other. And in my written testimony, I have some suggestions, for example, in reformulating the baseline so that it is truly neutral between tax and spending decisions as you come to terms with the large debt problem. And I guess I would echo what's now been said several times about the importance of building on success. There are things that the Congress and the President have gotten done in recent years, and they have been 2-year agreements on how to fund the appropriations and what the levels of spending will be. Those are perhaps a sign that the budget resolution should be a 2-year resolution, that we should have something closer to a biennial budget. It's also true that the President has signed those agreements in every case. Perhaps that's indication that it's time to move from a concurrent resolution to a joint resolution where there is agreement on budgetary totals, appropriations, mandatories, taxes, and the borrowing between the House, the Senate, and the White House, something that doesn't happen right now. I regularly tell people the U.S. government does not have a budget. It doesn't have a fiscal policy. It doesn't have any single document that everyone agrees on for how it will add up. Instead, we have budgetary outcomes, usually bad. And it's time to change that record. And so I think building on that success, I think, would be an important thing. There's a lot of talk about different ways to manage internally the enforcement, carrots and sticks on getting things done. And there have been attempts at, no budget, no pay, no budget, no recess, a variety of sticks. I was encouraged to think about carrots in the process of preparing my testimony. I try not to think about vegetables very often, but I did. It's hard, but it seems to me that there are some techniques that would be modeled on essentially the Gephardt rule, which used to provide for deeming the debt limit as being passed when you pass the budget resolution, that would allow Congress to address some votes that are politically toxic but which are real, like giving yourself a pay raise, which should happen and which is an impossible vote for anyone to take, and that if you pass a budget resolution, there would be a process to expedite those kinds of votes. And I would encourage you to think about those things, because we do need to both fix the budget process, but we also need to fund the government and fund the people who make this government run in a timely and efficient fashion. And so I thank you for the chance to be here today. I would say that I would be happy to aid this process in any way, not just at this hearing, but in the months to come.
Thank you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, and Ms. Coven as well for your prepared testimony here today. We're going to move into the Q&A period. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you have a thoughtful analysis in your prepared remarks of the pros and cons of making the budget resolution a joint resolution and sending it to the President early in the year. On one hand, it certainly establishes executive branch buy-in early in the process, but on the other hand, could be giving the White House a little more power than they currently have and turn even more authority over to them, even make the congressional budget process worse if in fact there is no agreement. So expand on your prepared testimony on these thoughts. Talk about the trade-offs, if you will.
I think you expanded on it perfectly. I offer it with mixed emotions, quite frankly. Funding the government is a congressional obligation under the Constitution. It is something that the power of the purse belongs in the Congress. The Congress is responsive to the voters, and I think there should be a deep commitment to that. But the way we're doing things right now, as I said, doesn't constitute genuine budgeting. There is no place where we require that it all add up and that people sign off on that plan on behalf of the voters. So the argument for going to a joint resolution is to have some vehicle for that buy-in by all parts of the government so that we actually get coherent fiscal policy and don't find ourselves in the position we are today. It could make things worse. It certainly changes the balance of power. You now have a president who has to sign off, and that's one more person who can play brinksmanship, one more person who can hold up the process, and it might in the end turn out to produce outcomes that are even worse than right now. I don't know for sure. So I can't give it an enthusiastic, no reservations endorsement, but I do think we need to be cognizant of the fact that we aren't really doing budgeting. We're doing a subset of it, and not very well.
Ms. Coven, you mentioned in your testimony that delays in getting the final appropriation numbers for an agency in any given year produces a significant impact on the agency's operation. Can't plan, and when they do a lot of contingency planning and a lot of what-ifs, there's a lot of inefficiency in that type of process. As an appropriator, I certainly agree with your testimony. Automatic CRs have been suggested as one way to reduce the potential of this brinksmanship. What impacts would an automatic CR have on the appropriations process and agency operations, in your opinion?
Well, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I think if you passed automatic CR legislation, you may as well disband the Appropriations Committees. It removes the incentive for there to be that process of carefully looking at the funding levels for each programs. I think further, it creates a risk that we will not have adequate funding, or funding will go to the wrong places, speaking of inefficiencies. If the government just continues, circumstances change on the defense side of the equation, on the non-defense side of the equation. We have private market forces that affect where those needs are in veterans' medical care and housing assistance. So the idea that the default plan is to just continue where funding had been previously, I think is a recipe for greater inefficiency rather than for a better process.
My last question for you is that many state and local governments have procedures in place to ensure that government still functions even if a new budget is not passed. I particularly like what Arkansas does. You know, it has a Revenue Stabilization Act, a form of a balanced budget agreement that forces the legislature to have to look at different components of government from time to time. Are these forms of government guardrails, as it were, appropriate? And if so, is there a model out there that we should look to?
Well, I don't know the precise model that you're pointing to in Arkansas. I will caution you, I think it's wonderful to set out, to provide yourselves with information about where we're heading so that you can judge whether the sum total of the actions that you've taken are pushing you in the right direction. I think if you move to something that is more rigid, like a cap, like a balanced budget requirement, anything like that, you are setting up a situation where you're kind of you're ignoring the underlying factors, which we know are an aging population and healthcare and revenues and the matters that you've considered. And you're sort of dodging the idea of making thoughtful policy choices and instead potentially letting some sort of automatic mechanism like sequestration be the solution. I don't think that was very popular here, and I don't think it was very popular around the country. So I think it's wonderful to provide yourselves with information, and that's one role the budget committees can play, but I'd really caution you against putting yourselves on some kind of autopilot.
My distinguished co-chair, Ms. Lowy.
Thank you. And thank you both for your testimony. It's interesting to me that while our two witnesses have different perspectives, you both make the point that budget process reforms should be policy neutral. And we would hope that reform should help facilitate good decision-making by Congress, but we should avoid things that try to force particular policy outcomes, such as fixed targets enforced by automatic spending cuts. I would appreciate if either of you would elaborate on that point.
I think there are a couple of reasons why this committee is not the right place to do that policymaking. First of all, you're tasked with the budget and appropriations process, not the fiscal policy of the United States, and so it seems like a bit of an overreach. The second, though, is if there isn't genuine buy-in, not just by your colleagues in the House and Senate, but by the public, inevitably, whatever targets, triggers, mechanisms you put in place will be overridden. We've seen this again and again and again, whether it was the SGR mechanism and the docs pay in Medicare. I'm old enough to remember Graham Rudman Hollings and fixed deficit targets, which we overrode because we couldn't hit them. People hadn't bought into matching them. There isn't, as Martha said, you can use these kinds of things to enforce an agreement, but you can't force a policy outcome, and I would urge you to not try.
I agree with that. The only thing I'd add is that you really, and this is related to what Doug said, you want your reforms to be durable. And we, as you all know, control of Congress and the presidency shifts from time to time, and you don't want the first order of business of each new Congress to be to rejigger the rules that the previous one set. So I think establishing policy neutrals will help make sure that these are lasting reforms.
I think I'll save my other questions and give opportunities to others. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Senator Perdue.
Thank you, and I'm so excited by your testimony. I've been through every word of it. Ms. Coven, there must be something wrong today. You're the Democratic witness today, and I agree with every word you've written here. In all seriousness, you make 4 recommendations: shift the fiscal year, look at biennial budgeting, get rid of debt ceilings, and use reconciliation if you're going to use it at all. Use it for what it was written for, and that's to reduce the deficit. But the thing I like the most, and we've all said this in different ways, not just the process here of the select committee should be politically neutral, but I believe the budgeting and funding process itself, the process, should be a politically neutral platform. And you say, I encourage you to approach this task in a politically neutral manner. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you say the same thing. Here's my question for both of you. There are a lot of things we can do to change the process, but there are 2 issues. One is policy and one is outcome. The policy we're talking about, let's separate the process from the policy in this select committee, is my opinion, and look for a politically neutral platform. Senator Hirono said it best, I think, in our first meeting, that her only wish here is that we have a process in which we'll never have to use a CR again. I think it's a high calling, and I love it because I think it's very simple and it ought to be our outcome. The thing that we're trying to do here is fund the government. Would you both help me? You both talked about consequences, you both talked about incentives, but if we have a process and we get to the end of the fiscal year, and let's say it's 12/31, along with the calendar year, Ms. Coven, would you start, and Dr. Holtz-Eakin, I'd love to get your opinion. What can we do to hold ourselves accountable and get that done so that we don't have to deal with what if we don't do it? That's where sequestration was born. It's where the Budget Control Act was born. We need a process that functions without all the drama. And by the way, every other country in the world, every company I know of, and every state I know of does this without the drama of the U.S. federal government. Would you guys just address how we get there at the end of this process?
So I'll start, I guess. Thank you. And I thought a bit about this, obviously, after being invited to testify. I think the best thing you can do is look for the natural break points for the United States Congress. And December, usually the end of the year, is the most natural break point in the action for you. Sometimes it's the end point because you know a new Congress is taking office.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right?
And it gives us more time during the year, too. So my question is, if you don't get that done by that date, what happens? And what are the things you would suggest to us to hold us accountable to where we would do it?
So, I mean, Doug put some of those ideas on the table. I'm not sure. You all are adults. You take your responsibilities seriously. To me, having something that actually withholds your pay or something else from you, I don't know if that's a road that you want to walk down. My hope is that by rejiggering the calendar so that you really have, there's an expectation, and a lot of budget process operates through norms and expectations, that's enough to get things on course. But if you want to talk about stronger measures, I don't know.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not
Yeah.
looking for stronger measures, but
Yeah.
the reality is with a 14-week, but if you start January 1, which we do today,
Right.
you get a document from the White House, and we have 14 weeks for budgeting. You have 16, in the Senate, you have 16 authorizing committees. And by the way, we haven't authorized in years. The State Department for a while wasn't authorized for 15 years until 2 years ago. It's a joke. We're the only real entity that still uses an authorizing process. But that's 16 weeks, another 12 weeks for the appropriation. That's if you do one a week in the Senate, which has really never been done, obviously. Well, that's 42 weeks out of a 52-week calendar. There is no, even if you change the fiscal year, it's not going to happen. So I understand there have to be some structural changes, but Dr. Holtz-Eakin, help us with, very quickly, as I want to yield time to the other guys here as well.
I don't have a magic solution on that. I really don't. I mean, if you walk through the mechanics that you just outlined, the first thing that jumps out is maybe there are too many appropriations bills. Maybe 12 is the wrong number. But
is that what you meant by potentially incrementalizing our way there? That, let's say you do that, you go to biannual, you reduce the number of appropriation bills, you give yourself a better chance. Then the major question is, do we still need an authorizing process? Well, I don't have time. I'll submit that question to both of you. I'd love to get your response on that.
Sure.
Most every other entity we looked at in the last 3 years has a budgeting process that has efficacy. It has an appropriating process that works. Very few, if any, had an authorizing built in there. The authorizing was part of the budgeting allocation process. You familiar with that?
yeah, why don't I get back to you in writing?
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you both for your testimony, not only here, but in many other Budget Committee hearings. Is it fair to say that you can't even calculate the deficit in any given year without looking at revenues, appropriated spending, healthcare spending, and tax spending? It's just a mathematical truth, correct?
That is true.
Both witnesses agree that is a mathematical truth. Good. And how broadly accepted is debt to GDP ratio as the metric, whatever the number actually is, but as the metric that we should be looking at with respect to a sustainable national debt?
I think that's pretty widely accepted. The footnote on that would be, what measure of debt do you want to put in their debt in the hands of the public or total debt? So I would be a fan of debt in the hands of the public as the economically relevant measure.
Ms. Coven?
I would agree, but you made an important distinction, which is what the number actually is, and that can vary with the business cycle. So it's not that there even is one number, but as a general measure.
Conversation should be about debt to GDP
it's a very
with
useful
those asterisks.
conversation to have. Correct.
Okay, that's good to know. And are we going to be able to fix this in a year, or do you need to plan for a glide slope that gets you from where we are to where we need to be?
It will certainly take many years. And in terms of where you need to be, I think the economically relevant thing is that the U.S. display to global capital markets that debt to GDP is on a downward trajectory, even if a tiny slope. But
Let me
right
jump in
now
on
it's
that,
going
because that's
straight
a
up.
point that I'd like to ask you guys about. Let's say that all that this committee did was to secure the passage through Congress of a plan that set a sustainable debt to GDP ratio and set a mechanism for a glide slope to get there, and some alarms to let you know if you got off course. How do you believe global markets would react to that achievement now?
I don't think they'd react at all. Because I think global markets would view that the way I view it, which is that's a fairly empty promise since you haven't got political buy-in on the policies.
So
that
you'd
will
actually have to
happen.
start doing it.
Yeah,
Okay. And then how would they react?
that would be a very good day.
Okay. You have talked about the reconciliation process. In my view, in the Senate, it's been hijacked to completely unrelated purposes from dealing with the debt or the deficit. It's a bipartisan sin. We used reconciliation to help pass Obamacare. The Republicans just used reconciliation to pass massive deficit-creating tax cuts. So, and make this a response for the record if it's going to take a long time, but I'd be interested in what constraints or restrictions you think we might be able to agree on that would actually be effective in limiting reconciliation to its intended purpose now that it's kind of gotten out of control. How do we get it back in the cage?
Yeah, I want to make one very important distinction, though, which is that whatever your feelings on this panel may be about Obamacare, that was not legislation that was scored as adding to the deficit. I think we've seen that more in the tax arena, but it's certainly possible
Yeah,
in the
and
entitlement
as somebody who
arena.
supported it very energetically, I like it too. I get all that, but I don't think it was our view that we were doing that as part of a debt and deficit measure. That was
That was not
designed
the
as a
primary
healthcare
purpose,
measure
right.
and to help people across the country. And we used this process because it worked, not because we were trying to solve primarily a debt or deficit problem.
Right, right. But I think the important thing is that it is more important that reconciliation not be abused and increase the deficit than to set some particular target for how much deficit reduction has to be achieved in order to have that tool.
Exactly.
The risk is in the negative direction, so what I would do is implement something like what used to be the Conrad rule in both chambers, which is to say that you can't use it to increase the deficit.
Okay. And if you have any further or more complicated thoughts than that you want to put in writing for me, I'd be interested, because we do need to solve, I think, the abuse of the reconciliation process in all of this.
So briefly, the thing I would just mention for everyone is that reconciliation is really a way to get around the rules of the Senate.
Yeah, exactly.
In the end. And so since this is a
And the Senate Budget
bicameral
Committee has become a delivery
entity,
system for that
I would
rule-breaking.
hesitate to dictate to one chamber how they're going to run themselves. So I would
Just
think
asking
about
for recommendations. You're not going to be dictating. Last thing, the debt ceiling. Upside, downside, specifically, what does it look like if one day we should fail at passing a needed debt ceiling and went into default?
U.S. Treasuries are the foundation of the global financial system. Impairing their liquidity even a little bit would be an economic catastrophe. It can't happen.
And similarly, the programmatic consequences of having to tell the American people, our contractors, everyone else we do business with, that we're not sure when we can pay you is, and we had to deal with planning for this, and a few years ago when we actually got up to it, it's no way to run a railroad.
Thank you both. Thank you to the chairman.
Mr. Arrington of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panelists for your thoughtful testimony and responses to our questions. As a new member, I've been surprised by a lot of things, but not the least of which has been the lack of accountability and oversight, which is the governing part of the job I thought was going to take most of my time. I think in my, again, year of service, whether it was on the VA committee or some other agriculture authorizing committee where we have oversight responsibilities, I think the lack of oversight has created a culture that lacks accountability and a focus on results. And so the federal government's not operating effectively for, in service to its citizens. I can't tell you how many times I've asked the question, so tell me, before we, fund or reauthorize your program or make recommendations for such, how's it going? Are you achieving the desired outcomes? Are you off the chain great, or are you way underperforming? And maybe we need to invest more money in this because it's working so well to serve the veterans or the farmers or what have you. So I believe that we could have a policy-neutral recommendation to have oversight before we actually throw money at something that may not be achieving its desired outcome, whether it's a Republican idea or program or it's a Democrat idea or program. Can you both comment on how in the world we get back to that component of regular order, good business, and as my friend and fellow Texan says, common sense?
So I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think we don't take a hard enough look at particularly some of the programs that we set in motion and ask ourselves, do we know it's working? Is it achieving the results that we're asking? The question was raised earlier, I think, by Senator Perdue about what the role for the authorizing committees is, and I think one useful reform coming out of this process could be to step up the expectation that they are the partners with the Appropriations Committee in asking those hard questions. Now, in fairness to the appropriators, those questions do get asked of federal agency witnesses and others who come before them every year to defend their budget request and explain why the administration thinks funding should be increased in one place and cut in another. But the authorizing committees have a lot of scope to do this, to delve more deeply, to answer the questions you've asked. And I think their thoughts should have more input into the decisions that are made by appropriators.
Thank you.
I'm going to echo that, and I'll do it via a very particular example, which is Chairman Womack recently had me testify in front of an oversight hearing for the Congressional Budget Office. It was the first time I had delivered such testimony, even though I ran it. There were no oversight hearings. The closest that I came to an oversight hearing was the Ledge Branch Appropriations Bill, when I had to defend CBO's budget request and explain what we did and how we're going to use that money. I think that's a real problem, and I would echo that a good use of the authorizing committees is to have them be your partners with a much more explicit role for this. And if you have a different calendar, they can go first, and then you can appropriate based on the results.
Senator Whitehouse is gone. Is he here? No, he's left. Well, I want to say that I align my thinking about how we ultimately get at responsible and effective outcomes. I recognize that we may not get there, and we may just have a better process, a smoother, more seamless process. I'm for that, by the way, and so I like the glide slope. I like the targets. I don't know what mechanisms or accountability or pain or shame or carrot or stick that is going to move this seemingly immovable body. So it is discouraging after we got the history of almost 200 years of reforms, and then we look and it's $21 trillion in debt. I do think the fixed target and glide slope idea, I think it's a great idea. I just don't know how in the world we're going to change the behavior of the United States Congress. Isn't that the million-dollar question here? On anything, whether it's timeliness, whether it's unauthorized to now authorized spending, whatever it is, isn't the million-dollar question, how do we change the behavior of this animal that doesn't seem to want to change? Give us some ideas on that, in that regard.
So this has come up a number of times around the globe, and the essential issue is that there's nothing that you can do in the way of a mechanism that you can't also undo. And so you can't bind yourself to delivering any particular outcome or process or whatever. So in other places, Scandinavia, there are a couple countries who did this, you adopt fixed fiscal rules that bind the parliament in that case that they have to adhere to. In our case, that would require amending the Constitution. That is the thing which you cannot change, to which you must adhere, and that's a very high bar for changes.
Gentleman from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your testimony, and I'm glad to hear you both reject the notion of no budget, no pay, or no budget, no recess. It seems to me that's a recipe for doing shoddy, sloppy work. There's an incentive to do anything to avoid those repercussions rather than to do responsible work. Ms. Coven, I have a question for you. Dr. Holtz-Eakin suggested that we consider a joint budget resolution to get the president more involved in the process earlier. He also suggested that change would have pluses and minuses. What's your view of that potential change, and how would you weigh the advantages and disadvantages for that change?
So I'm not a fan of that proposal, and Doug helped to explain some of the pitfalls. Let me just amplify briefly. So first of all, if you think what we need is more gridlock, that to me is the recipe for it. It's hard enough to get an ordinary budget resolution done. As you all have said, they often don't get done. Inviting another party into that negotiation could make it more difficult. Secondly, it's a power shift in two directions, not only one shipping some of your Article 1 power down the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, but also if we're talking about this resolution being a 51 voter, shifting power away from the minority party in the Senate. And as the saying goes, sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug. You don't know which party you are in that situation. So the idea that you would permanently say, well, the minority just doesn't have a voice doesn't make sense to me in something as important as this. And the third thing is it risks us ending up, if it's a bill, which it would be if it were signed into law by the president, becoming a Christmas tree, a mega budget bill, a mega revenue bill that tangles everything up in one big knot. So while I understand and appreciate the notion that you want the Congress and the president to be on the same page, and I've suggested it with regard to caps and appropriations because that's just practical, otherwise the government shuts down, the idea of trying to do the whole ball of wax in one fell swoop seems to me too ambitious and likely to deteriorate the process rather than improve it.
I appreciate that. This morning, I woke up to see that Senator Enzi has floated the idea of possibly doing away with the Budget Committee. I don't know if he was talking about in just the Senate. So I'm interested in getting your thoughts on that. And also something that occurred to me once, is an idea I have no idea whether it makes any sense or not to even think about it, but the possibility of a joint committee to essentially save a step when the Senate and House developed a budget resolution together. Any thoughts on either of those?
I'm not familiar with what possessed Mr. Enzi to suggest getting rid of his committee, so I won't answer that one. In the template that was the Budget Act, the Budget Committee says as a coordinating function and as a consolidator and as handling the reconciliation process made perfect sense. Like much of this, it just hasn't worked out so well. So that suggests that some change does make sense. I see no reason why a joint committee wouldn't be a good first step. If nothing else, the act of looking at the problems together, identifying the range of solutions together would inform both chambers in a much more effective fashion than we're getting right now. There's a lot to be said for just knowing what ideas will and will not fly on the other side of the Capitol.
Thank you. Do you have some thoughts, Ms. Goldman?
Just really briefly, the only thing I'd say is that I do like the idea that a number of people have expressed, and I think members of this panel, of making sure that the Budget Committee can speak for both chambers, whether that's a joint committee or separate committees, and is well represented in terms of your leadership, the tax writing committees, the entitlement committees, and so on. So I just think if it remains, it should make sure that it does speak for the chamber and can provide leadership for the rest of the chamber.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to go back and revisit it. We've had an interesting conversation about the sticks and the carrots because it's wonderful we're going through this process. And I believe it's extremely important that we find a solution that we can adhere to. But I think that many that have served in the Senate and the House before us thought that they also had a process that we could adhere to. And I would argue, I again want to go back and visit some of the sticks because like no budget, no pay, or no budget, no recess. We have found that, you know, and I'm going to push back on the shoddy workmanship because I would say the omnibus bill that we just had was shoddy workmanship. 4 or 5 people involved in a process. It's thrown together. We vote on it. We go home. You know, everybody is maybe not necessarily happy, but wow, look, we have a product. We have to do our job, and what we have seemed to found lately in the United States Senate is, especially if you look at our nominations process, which also seems to be hampered, is that when the leader starts threatening to hold over weekends or cancel recesses, all of a sudden we start getting our nominations through the process. So I do think that we should have a discussion. We should not dismiss this just outright. I think that we need to be doing our jobs, but we are humans and we like to go home on the weekends and we like to see our family at Christmas and Thanksgiving. If those sticks are out there, perhaps we know and we can plan ahead and understand that we need to get our jobs done. Would you please, if you could, maybe make comments about sticks and carrots that have been used in the past, maybe in your experience, that have tended to work or not tended to work?
I don't have a long list of things. Most of the things that have been used have been mechanisms designed to make you hit a particular budgetary target, say a deficit target or a spending target, and you can override those mechanisms, so they have not been effective at all. But by and large, process doesn't produce solutions. There has been some no budget, no pay sort of sentiment, and at least my understanding is that's probably not constitutional, so I would suggest not going that route. It is, however, I think constitutional for you to not see your family. So I'd echo what Martha said about the empirical regularity with which things get done as you back up against a recess or some other part of the calendar. That does seem to motivate people to get things done.
Thank you. Ms. Coven.
Just one thing to add to that, which is that as you think about those kinds of mechanisms, make sure that the collateral consequences fall on Congress and not on the American people.
Exactly. I would agree wholeheartedly with that. It is incumbent upon us to make sure that we get our jobs done. And I would say, just as I stated in my opening comments, that for 44 years, only 4 times have we done our job. So that speaks to, is wonderful, going through a process, making sure we have rules in place to do that, but we have to have the desire to get it done. Otherwise, we just find ways around it, and we end up with continuing resolutions and omnibus bills. Yes, Dr. Holtz-Eakin.
I want to just echo something that Martha said earlier, which is I think it's a good thing that you revisit the budget process. There's no reason why you should budget the same way all the time. Budgets should reflect priorities and problems, and these change for the nation, and the process should change with it. And if you make changes, I believe the folks who made those changes, meaning your colleagues and you, will have a buy-in to make them work. And there's more to this than rigid mechanical things. There is pride of craftsmanship in doing one's job well, and if you settle on a new budget process, I think it will, at least for some time, be in and of itself enough to get things moving better.
Thank you, and I appreciate the time, and again, I am truly looking forward to this. I think we can find a solution that hopefully we'll be able to market and sell to the rest of our colleagues, but it is up to us to get it done and not look for specific loopholes that we can use in the process. So thank you, I yield.
Representative Kilmer.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks again for being with us. I think this conversation around carrots and sticks is actually kind of a important one, in part because it seems like a lot of the sticks that have been used, the damage has accrued to the American taxpayer or to the military, and in part because when the sticks accrue to Congress, it finds a way to get around it, right? It waives them. So I think it's worth thinking about, is there more of a positive inducement to get Congress to do the right thing? And I know you've been asked that in various ways, but I'd just encourage us collectively to think about that down the road. I want to ask about when we get on the eve of a shutdown. The chairman asked, should there be an auto CR? Some have suggested an auto CR minus 1%, or some have suggested an auto CR plus 1%, or, and it seems like the problem is whichever route you choose, someone will like that route, and it creates an incentive for inaction. I understand that during the Clinton years, they said no CR beyond 2 days, and they did 21 of them, but they eventually got there on an agreement. What's the right, what do you think on the eve of a potential shutdown? What would you recommend as a smarter approach?
My first recommendation would be for this committee to be so successful that we're not on the eve of a
Amen. I'm
shutdown,
with you. Yeah.
right? That's the fundamental indictment of this era, right?
Yeah.
The second is, I think you should not rely on a mechanism. Mechanisms become someone's preferred policy, whether you anticipate it or not. Right. Mechanisms can be overridden. That happens all the time. So if you're going to have a situation like that, empower someone in the Congress, someone who has been elected to make decisions, to make a decision to keep the government open. And the idea of you handing over all of your hard-earned clout from running for elections and being in the Congress, handing it over to someone else to do whatever they want is going to really make you not want to do it.
I agree with that. I think you can't automatic anything
Right.
in this process.
I know that there's been some suggestion of taking OMB out of the budget process. I wanted to get your reaction to that, and if that happened, wouldn't CBO need a whole lot more resources?
I was unaware of that. It's a bad idea. The CBO was created because up until 1974's Budget Act, the only source of budgetary information was the Office of Manager's Budget. Prior to that, the Bureau of the Budget. It's a good thing for the executive and for the legislation to have their own entities. And bluntly, competition is a good thing. It is a good thing for CBO to look over to OMB and say, geez, do you think they did a better job of figuring out what's going to happen here? And vice versa. So I am inherently skeptical of monopolies, and government monopolies are no better than any other.
I'd also add to that another really important function of OMB, and particularly agency budget offices, is they just have a lot more information about what's going on because they're operating the executive branch. So CBO performs a somewhat different function, and it is the ultimate truth teller, but you also need the agencies in OMB aggregating this information, which they are privy to because they're actually in the day-to-day operational mode.
Yeah, you spoke about the importance of CBO as a neutral voice, sort of calling the balls and strikes. Are there measures you think we ought to take to protect the integrity of CBO, as an impartial referee in the budget process?
I think it does a pretty good job, and I would more caution you against tampering with their ability to tell it straight than say that there are major reforms that are needed now.
Okay. You know what? I think I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you, Chairman. How are you, Beth?
Thank you. Senator Langford.
Thank you. I appreciate this. Let me try to pepper y'all with a whole series of questions. And first, let me push on a little bit what we were already talking about with auto CR. You had mentioned not want to have auto anything, and I understand that. We're trying to figure out how to be able to make sure we protect us from having shutdowns. And at the end of the day, at some future Congress, there's not resolution. How do we keep us going? As you mentioned, hold the American people harmless, put consequences here to be able to get it done. That's been the conversation about we don't go home. There's automatic quorum calls where we stay in session continuously until we get it finished. But there has to be some kind of process to make sure that the American people are held harmless in this. So that's going to require some mechanism in place. Policy neutral or not, some mechanism has to be there. Agree or disagree? That would mean something has to be automatic, I would say.
Not if it means an automatic CR. No.
Okay, what would you recommend instead? You get to the end of a budget year.
I think what we find is Congress pretty quickly figures out that it's created a mess and it cleans it up. And that's a better thing than putting the government on autopilot.
Okay.
My suggestion was an automatic decision-making process. Kick it to the majority leader of the House and the president pro tempore of the Senate, just to make it up on the spot. But somebody has to make a decision on what will and will not get funded, and the threat of handing it over to those individuals is what should motivate you to not end up there.
Okay, let me bring back up the issue about a budget committee going away. That is an issue that's been around for several decades at this point. As I go through the notes of this body in 1993, kicking around budget reforms, even at that point, 20 years into the Budget Reform Act, the Act of 74, there was already this conversation that was brewing about leadership establishing the 302As, and it would be leadership of the House and the Senate being able to work through the process and then bringing that to the body to be able to vote on, and then the body establishes those 302As. But basically, you've got, as the term that was used during that time by Senator Castlebaum, you've got someone with a little more clout in the process to be able to make that decision early on. What's your thoughts about a budget 302As being established by a leadership group, voted on by the House and the Senate? Obviously, the president would have to vote on that as well to be able to make it law, and then to be able to work from there.
So I think the key insight is that the budget committees, as they're currently constituted, can't remain. And the question is, do you want to make them more powerful by putting on them leadership, Ways and Means, Senate Finance, key committees like that, or do you want to make them go away? But they existed the way they do now because there was supposed to be the entire scope of operation, revenues, mandatories, discretionaries. They had that key coordinating function. No one's doing all that, so the budget committee has no role.
Right. Martha, you have a thought on that?
I agree with that. I would just say that there is some role for oversight of the budget broadly, and that it worries me to think that Congress would have no group of people whose task was to be looking at the reports that CBO comes out, to be thinking about the long-term fiscal trajectory, et cetera.
No, I'd agree with that. Currently, our process is leadership decides everything at the end. How do we switch it to where there's a decision at the beginning on what the main number is and get more people involved in oversight throughout the process rather than no oversight anywhere in the process?
Right.
And try to figure out how to be able to resolve that. The concept of CBO and some of the scoring issues, I brought it before, chimps, pension smoothing, payment shifts, even PAYGO has become just a speed bump of late rather than something that's an actual mechanism. Are there recommendations that you would make to be able to reform some of these processes to make sure that they work?
So that's an issue that's broader than CBO. Right. There are the scorekeepers, the OMB folks, CBO folks, appropriators, budget committee staff, minority, majority, who have met regularly for years and years, decades, and agreed upon the budgetary treatment of certain transactions like chimps and a variety of other things. You could legislate that they go away. Other than that, there's nothing else that you can do.
Is there a gain to having them?
They are the little grease that is left to get things through, and grease is great until you abuse it. And so the question is it being abused?
Okay.
There is a stock of them built into the base, so I think you can't just say, let's get rid of chimps without acknowledging that you're getting rid of billions of dollars of budget authority that's supporting programs that you all have voted for. That's
Is
the only
that
thing I'd say.
budget authority, does that add to deficit, or is that?
It's part of the aggregate totals that you provide when you pass an omnibus spending bill, and I just think we need to acknowledge that that's part of the totals that
Totally
exist.
agree. Yeah, totally agree. And that's been my challenge is if chimps go away, you're not reducing deficit, but you are getting a more accurate number that's out there. And part of the challenge that we have right now is actually getting to the number. We have the number that's budgeted, then you have chimps, then you have OCO, and then you have emergency funding, and everyone just says, no, but just look at this number, but the total aggregate debt is something completely different. And if we're going to go through this process, I think there should be some gain in to try to clean up so we get a number that's actually the number. That I yield back.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for testifying. Just before this hearing, White House Economic Advisor Larry Kudlow said, and I quote, "Never believe CBO," end quote, because he claims they don't score tax cuts right. Do you agree?
I don't agree with that.
I have a lot of disagreement with that, beginning with his misunderstanding. The Joint Committee on Taxation is responsible for scoring tax bills.
Well, Congressman Kilmer asked whether we should move to protect CBO's independence, and Ms. Coven, you said that you thought that they do a pretty good job, but when we start talking about some people wanting them to engage in dynamic scoring and other ways to make whatever programs they're pushing look better, maybe we do need to ensure the independence of CBO as long as we're looking to them as that independent voice for us.
I think anything you can do to strengthen that function would be terrific, and it's interesting to see how that discussion played out on dynamic scoring, because there was what the Joint Tax Committee said, and then there's what lots of other people said, and then there's what a one-pager out of the Treasury Department said, and people are hanging their hats on whatever's convenient. But I agree that protecting the integrity of what they produce and the Joint Tax Committee is really important.
Do you agree?
I do. I would just hasten to add that, in my experience, this is a very common occurrence. People are always lobbying for their programs to be fantastic and free, And they want you to say that, and it is business as usual to ignore that and just do the work.
Well, I like what you said, that competition is good, that we have the executive branch putting out their best explanation of what's going to happen, and then we rely on CBO as an independent voice. Well, hope does spring eternal that this select committee will be able to come up with a budget reform that is policy neutral, because the broken process we have hurts real people. I wanted to ask Ms. Coven, one of our tasks is to explain to the American people why the budget and appropriation process, or lack of process, matters in their everyday lives. And I'm sure many people are unaware of the serious challenges that agencies face during shutdowns or CRs. And in particular, I'm sure many people don't realize that agencies like labor, education, and the others that you oversaw face potential life and death concerns when faced with congressional inaction. My question to you is, could you elaborate on the situation or situations you were referring to in your testimony where you had to determine when a situation was so precarious that there is a threat to human life?
Yes, I'd be glad to, and thank you for asking that. So we have a law that has existed, I think, since the 1800s, I want to say, called the Anti-Deficiency Act, that makes it such that the executive branch cannot expend funds that Congress has not provided. So when the government is operating during a shutdown, one of the tasks that executive branch officials are engaged in is making sure that we do not violate that statute. There are criminal penalties attached to it, if you want to talk about sticks. So we were in a situation during one of the shutdowns where the WIC program, which provides nutritional support for infants and pregnant women and young children, was starting to run out of carryover and contingency funds. And right before the government thankfully reopened, we were in the process of trying to make a determination of whether or not, per the terms of the Anti-Deficiency Act, there was an imminent threat to the safety of human life if babies were not going to be able to get nutritional support, consulting with medical experts. These are hours of my life I can't believe I spent and I'd love to have back. The idea that that's what we should be engaged in when we are implementing the federal budget is absurd, and was heartbreaking to go through those discussions with medical experts.
And that's just one concrete example of our inaction, our inability to do our jobs, how it impacts real-life people, literally in life or death situations. Are both of you familiar with the Convergence Center's Building a Better Budget Process report?
Yes.
So if so, would you care to comment, both of you, on the report or any of the recommendations?
I'd be happy to get back to you. It'd be a long, long answer. I'd be happy to provide it. There's a lot of interesting ideas in there.
Good.
I think the one quick thing I would call out is I do like the idea of sort of standardizing and more regularly presenting to Congress and the public the snapshot of where we stand and where we might be headed. And CBO does lots of products like that, but I think there is some logic to consistently providing information in a form that people start to recognize and can use.
I think that's really important because there are suggestions that we have a fiscal state of the nation report every 4 years, for example, and pretty regular performance of portfolio of federal programs reports, just to let people know what the heck is happening. I think that's good. And then they also say that we should synchronize the budget cycle with the electoral cycle. That's a pretty straightforward recommendation. Do you have an opinion about that particular recommendation?
The only thing I'd say is if what that really, and I think there was some hinting at things that are a little bit more like a joint budget resolution in that document, and I have urged caution on that. I think that is not the best path to walk down, but in terms of synchronizing the calendar and particularly setting limits on appropriations every 2 years makes a ton of sense to me.
Did you want to add to that?
I'd concur with that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll pick up on the Anti-Deficiency Act. We've talked a lot about the 74 Budget Act, but prior to the reinterpretation of the Anti-Deficiency Act during the Reagan era, right, we didn't have these kinds of shutdowns. We were kind of on autopilot. Given your experience at OMB, Ms. Coven, you have said you would not support an autopilot. You don't want to go back to the Carter days where the American people are held harmless and the shutdown is just a Word document. You want it to have consequences.
I want Congress to make choices,
right.
Yes.
Thinking about your calendar year idea, of course, we started down this road in 76, went back in 86 and moved the fiscal year from July to October. I went back and looked just over the past 20 years. Turns out in 11 of those last 20 years, we didn't make it by January 1st either. So you've solved half the problem with that idea. candidly, I think solving half the problems sometimes is a pretty good start. Knowing of our failure to have those funding decisions resolved even by January 1st, you still see the merit of the calendar year vision.
I do, because the delays are shorter, which means the implementation can happen more quickly, and agencies and others who receive federal funds can make better use of them, yes.
Mr. Holtz-Eakin, when we talked about misusing reconciliation, I appreciate those comments in Ms. Coven's testimony. She quickly corrected the record of Obamacare being a money saver, which of course is exactly what CBO reported. Anytime you start taxes in year 1 and benefits in year 5, you tend to create a money saver. We gamed the system there. If we looked at over 20 years, we'd have gotten a different number, 30 years a different number. You said some of those games, chimps, in response to Senator Langford's questions, weren't the purview of the CBO to sort out, but given your experience as the scorekeeper, in the same way that process changes can be used, to Mr. Kilmer's point, in favor of or against folks who simply prefer that policy, I found our CBO scores to be that very same way. I can draft the legislation to achieve my goals in ways that pervert CBO's scoring to give me the freedom I need to have my language. What have you learned about how we could address CBO in ways that limit the perversion of some of the scoring games that go on now?
CBO's job is to identify the federal budget cost of legislation. That is its primary function as a scorer. And it's not supposed to identify the benefits. It identifies the federal budget costs over the budget window specified by the budget committees at that point in time. Sometimes it's been 2 years. Right now it's 10. It's been a lot of things. And for that reason, it is always possible to, quote, game CBO, because they will score the legislation and not the legislation's intent. And you can, by front-loading things and leaving things out of the budget window, give a misleading presentation of the intent of a bill. I don't think you should pretend that you can fix CBO or fix the scoring process to avoid that. You need to provide a lot of information. You can ask CBO, what do the second 10 years look like? You can bring that into the debate on the floor, and the way you stop those things is voting no.
I find it incongruous to have a conversation about the critical importance of a nonpartisan referee calling the balls and the strikes as they exist, and the understanding that I can recraft the rules for CBO to get just about any result I want at the same time. It seems that the utility of an unbiased scorekeeper is undermined by biased rules. I'd also point out, when we no longer even use the CBO's baseline, when we find it not useful, there is some opportunity for change. But let me close with this and ask you if you have counsel. Yes, it's true we do things differently than anybody else does. We have a budget that seems fairly partisan. We have authorizers that do some oversight and not. And we have appropriators who actually get the job done at the end of the day. I think that structure can be politically useful. It allows lots of places to let steam out of the system. Yes, we could be more efficient, but I'm not sure that efficiency and utility are synonyms. Do you all have thoughts on that as experts in the field?
I think it's a good observation. I can say honestly that I thought one of my jobs at CBO was to have Congress scream at me and vent their frustration. And that was just part of going to the office, and that was fine, because Congress needs to vent on occasion, but it also needs to get its work done. If you need to do the venting first, good.
The only thing I'd add is that the biggest observation I had shifting from working in the legislative branch to the executive branch is that here there are 535 people all up for re-election. In the executive branch, there's one person up for re-election at most once. So it makes sense that your process with 535 people constantly responding to the needs of the American people, it's going to be a little bit more complex than it is when one person's making decisions.
Thank you both. Mr. Chairman, you back.
Mr. Roy Ball Allard. Make sure that mic's on.
Being that I just came out of an appropriations hearing, I'm going to ask a question with regards to the appropriations process. One of the things that's always been annoying is to receive a president's budget request that zeroes out funding for a popular program that the administration knows Congress is going to add back to the final appropriations bill. And then this has a ripple effect throughout the budget and appropriations, because in order to fund the program that is so popular, something else has to give. And then there's the debate as to what that is going to be. What recommendations do you have to maybe stop this practice, which has been used by both administrations and both parties? And what are your thoughts about how we should look at the duplicative programs or cases where agencies are operating somewhat outside the lanes, even if the programs are popular? Because I believe that that contributes to the overall budget delays and problems that we face today.
So I think this happens in two kinds of circumstances, and one I think is legitimate and one isn't. The non-legitimate use of what you described is when the president fully supports that activity and is just playing games to get the numbers to fit. And I think that's not something that should continue, and Congress, whatever pressure you can apply to make sure it discontinues, particularly in the agencies. But there's a legitimate use of it, which is if what you're asking the president for is a request that reflects what he or she thinks the best distribution of resources across the country is, it may well be that the president, again, who is not quite as interactive with the voters on a regular basis, is exerting some courage and saying, this isn't working and I'm zeroing it out and I know it's popular, but I think these resources can be spent somewhere else. And I frankly think you want a president's budget that makes some of those kinds of choices and shows you where, with the expertise of the full expertise of the executive branch, where you can make shifts towards better use of resources. Then you all can decide if that's a direction you want to follow or not. But you wouldn't want the president anticipating what your political choices are rather than providing you his or her best judgment.
So let me echo the second part of that. In my experience in 2 White Houses, there were a long, long list of programs that the career staff at OMB had identified as candidates for elimination. And so it wasn't so much the political process that was doing it, it was the review process that looked for the effectiveness of programs and whether they were meeting their objectives, and if they weren't, they should not be there. So I think that's a legitimate thing and that you should respect it. I think the second part of the question was about really oversight, right? If we've got duplicative programs and we have things that are wandering outside their legislative intent, the oversight process should be catching that and reining it in. And if it's not, then that's the call for better oversight.
And when I came in, was there a question by Senator Hirano with regards to how we could make the budget more transparent and understandable for the public? Did I hear that? Or
I think she was referencing a proposal by this convergence group that included this fiscal report, yes.
And you're going to be responding in writing to that?
She asked for our thoughts on the whole convergence report, and I thought it'd be more efficient to just get back to her.
Okay, all right, okay, then I'll just leave it at that. And it seems to me that there's been a growth also in the number of policy writers that we've been considering in the appropriations bills, and that these policy fights are also contributing to delays in the process. Why do you think that is happening, and is there any ideas that you might have as to how we can address this?
So I think it is happening because you have the must-pass bills, and the remedy lies not necessarily in your committee, the Appropriations Committee, although stricter parameters, keeping those riders out would be terrific, but more in the rest of the Congress, making sure that there are other pathways for those legislative priorities to get addressed so the appropriations bills don't get bogged down with them.
I think my time is about run out.
All right, so the gentlelady is yielding back. All right, we have completed the Q&A round, recognizing that there's only a handful of our members left. I think it'd be appropriate if anybody has a burning question that can elicit a very brief response, I'd be more than willing to give that alibi right now to somebody if they wanted to ask something. Senator Perdue?
I'm sorry. I would like to iterate, though, for the record. I'd love to ask both these witnesses to provide this back to us, though, as a more in-depth conversation about the Senate's. The budget is a resolution. We pass it with 51% of the votes. The authorization is a law. We pass it with 60. The appropriation is a law. We pass it with 60. once the minority party has a budget resolution crammed down their throat, it's very difficult for them, Republican or Democrat, to come back in the authorizing process and play ball. It's very difficult for them to come back in the appropriation process and play ball. Please give us your thoughts about that three-step process and talk to us about other countries that you found that have done that. We can't find anybody that does a three-step process. So I think this authorizing issue is one we need to really focus on. We haven't talked about it much today, but in subsequent hearings, I suspect that we will end up going more in depth. But because of your two backgrounds, I would love to get you on the record relative to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Ms. Lowy?
I just, in conclusion, I think we've all asked many questions, and perhaps we'll save some of the other questions or repeat them again for the next time. So I would like to thank you both. As I look back upon the appropriations process, it would seem to me there are two things that are very evident. Number one, when we got a top-line number, the 302Bs for each of the committees, no problem. Our staffs worked together. Number two, the only thing that caused some problems was 169 of them, shall we say, what some of us would call poison pills. Others might say, oh, this is a very important policy decision. So maybe if the authorizers did their work, and the question would be, how do we keep those authorizing items away from the appropriations process, we'd be better off. And I think, Mr. Holtz-Eakin, you mentioned something about OMB. I think that's what you said, that we should be respecting it and the process. And it really depends on who's there at the time. Because I would say I've had totally different experiences, and I don't want to blame it on different parties, but I can remember one head of OMB who used to check in with me 3-4 times a week, and I don't think I've spoken to this head of OMB in the last 6 months. So how do you keep the politics out of the process, give us as appropriators the information so we can move forward? Because once we get those numbers, and I want to emphasize this again, on appropriations, the bipartisan work of our 12 subcommittees was so impressive. We got the numbers, we went to work, we got the job done, and then some other policy issues came up that would extend the process. But how do we move it forward so that Democrats and Republicans can do their work? And that's what I see as a major challenge here. But I think it's time for us to close this hearing, so let me thank you both for your excellent testimony and say it's a pleasure for me to work with my co-chair. Thank you.
Always a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin and Ms. Coven, for appearing before us today. I want to advise our members that they could submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record, and any member that wishes to submit a question or any extraneous material may do so within 7 days. And with that, let's go eat. The committee stands adjourned.